And hello, good evening. My name is Alexander Jones, and I am the boss list of the Epsilon Iota chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. On behalf of the chapter brotherhood, I welcome and thank you for attending our Uplift series number 6. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few reminders. All participants will be muted during this presentation, but we do encourage your active participation by utilizing the chat feature. All questions will be acknowledged at the appropriate time by Brother Ruel Dixon. On this upcoming November 17th, Omega Psi Phi will celebrate 109 years of service since the fraternity was founded on the campus of Howard University. On November 16th, we, the brothers of the Epsilon Iota chapter, will celebrate 30 years of service to the greater New Haven community. While we have been guided by our 4 cardinal principles of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift, Omega has played and continues to play a vital role in the social and economic growth of our country and enhancing the lives of African Americans. As a fraternity, we operate under 10 nationally mandated programs, which are centralized around issues in our communities. While our number one priority right now is our voter registration, education, and mobilization programs, and as we prepare to enter one of the most crucial and consequential elections of our time, we want to emphasize and continue to ask to make sure that everybody is doing their part by voting. I want to commend our Social Action Committee that went above and beyond as they saw a need to put together numerous platforms so that we could have these necessary conversations. I thank them for being true men of versatility and bringing forth this important topic of domestic violence awareness, especially during this global pandemic. At this time, I would like to introduce our series moderator, who is a brother who plays a key role in Omega, not only on a chapter, but on a district and international level. He is no stranger to the greater New Haven community, where he serves as a head coach of the Wilbur Cross Boys High School basketball team. Brother Walton also serves as a mentor to the youth, a leader among men, as well as an advocate for all. I will now turn it over to our Social Action Chairman, Brother Kevin Walton, who is also our Omega Uplift Series moderator.
Good evening. Thank you, Brother Bossless. Your check is in the mail for that nice introduction. So as Brother Jones said, we are members of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and not to be lost on the significance of this day is 106 years ago, on this date of October 28th, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity was incorporated in Washington, D.C. And for the past 109 years, we have built a strong and effective force of men dedicated to its cardinal principles of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift. A big part of our long and endearing legacy has been the dedication to uplifting the community in which we live, work, and serve. And tonight, we thought we'd provide uplift on a topic that is silent but prevalent. With October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we thought it important that we take a brief respite from our voter education, registration, and mobilization efforts to share some pertinent information about domestic violence, and specifically about domestic violence and COVID-19. So without further ado, let us get started. With us tonight on our panel, we have some very special guests, some expertise in the area. And I'd like to introduce them one by one. First, we have a gentleman who is no stranger to the New Haven community, Reverend Dr. Frederick Jerry Streets, who is a senior pastor of Dixwell Church. He's a clinical social worker and an adjunct associate professor at Yale Divinity School. We also have with us Mr. Lester Bentley, who was a domestic violence interventionist and also an adjunct professor at Gateway Community College, and has a relationship and working with the Family Violence Education Program at the Consultation Center in New Haven. Also with us, we're happy to have Detective Sherelle Carr from the New Haven Police Department Family Service Unit, and last and certainly not least, Ms. Paula Saracchia, site manager for Hope Family Justice Center, which recently opened in July 2019. So again, thank you all for taking the time to be with us here this evening. And without further ado, we'll turn it over and we'll allow Reverend Streets to have the first word with us this evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. And thank you for what you do in the community. two very quick caveats. If in our discussion about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, if you feel triggered in some way, please know that there are people who are available to help you. If you need to take a little break and come back to the screen, that's certainly fine. And the second thing is that everyone who's exposed to violence are not necessarily traumatized. So I don't want you to assume that to be treated in a violent situation automatically means the person is going to be traumatized. So my comments are very general, and I'll go through them quickly to help set the stage as we move forward. As we think about trauma, we're familiar with this image of bowling pins. Often when I ask people, if you were to give me one word that says what's essential for life, for living, people say food, shelter, clothing, safety, love, purpose, water, air, those kind of things. Imagine each of these bowling pins with one of those labels on it: food, shelter, air, purpose, meaningful living, love, safety. Trauma is when something happens to explode all of those things that we just mentioned, and they become memories for people, and those memories can affect their bodies and the way they act in the world. In my work as a clinical social worker and pastor, I'm often dealing with the suffering that remains. It's the impact of what happens after a person has been exposed to violence. And for some of them, they become traumatized. Trauma is the physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual wounds inflicted upon us by some form of violence. It is accompanied by the threat of death. A person is traumatized if they describe their experience as such. And traumatic experiences are related to loss, death, and grief, and pose a spiritual challenge to people who have been traumatized and may cause them to question their understanding of forgiveness, redemption, and hope. Not all persons who have experienced such a life-threatening event or a series of them will have the same reactions or develop symptoms of trauma. Sometimes the signs of emotional trauma are not as evident as are the external physical indications of having been harmed. A traumatic experience threatens our life. It can change our sense of self or identity, and it can result in a variety of physical, psychological, and neuropsychological difficulties and emotional symptoms that can lead to other emotional and physical problems. People who do experience trauma will react and recover differently from the traumatic experience. And this process of recovery is a function of factors such as the person's age, their culture, gender, sexual orientation, and access to resources. And grief is a very normal reaction to loss, and people who undergo a traumatic experience will also need to address their sense of what it is they feel they've lost. I was a part of the counseling social work education as we developed this description. Trauma results from adverse life experiences that overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope and to adapt positively to whatever threat he or she faces. Trauma exposure's lasting impact represents the combination of the event and the subjective thoughts and feelings it engenders, a combination of the facts of an event and how people internalize how they think about it and the feelings it creates. An event becomes traumatic when its adverse effects produces feelings of helplessness, lack of control, and thoughts that one's survival may be possibly in danger. We're all familiar when people are faced with major threats, the reactions are fight, flight, or freeze. And some people, this is a natural biological response, and people caught in violence can experience one or all of these in different times. Now, the tyranny of being traumatized is the constant self-conscious awareness of feeling and thinking of oneself as broken. Some people who are traumatized may also develop PTSD, a term that we've all heard about. A person who has been traumatic experience can develop signs of PTSD. They can also show signs of depression, anger, or profound sense of vulnerability, a loss of optimism and hope, minus some of the other features normally associated with a cluster of symptoms suggesting a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. The basic characteristics of PTSD is intrusion of memories. The person can't control remembering the violent experiences they've had, and the memories constrict or make them feel numb, and it can also put them on edge, causing them to always be have their arousal system. The little things can just tick them off. My colleague, Dr. Malika, tells us that a trauma story, there's the facts of what happens, but there's also the cultural meaning of trauma. And no matter what the facts are and what the culture of a person is, you have to look behind the facts and help understand the person's cultural background. And this is important for the listener-storyteller relationship. A major instrument of violence is always humiliation, and it's an expression of empathic failure. The person perpetrating violence just lacks, in that moment at least, a feeling of empathy, and they leave the person whom they've harmed often feeling humiliated. Trauma itself goes into our minds, our bodies, our spirits, and we can experience as stress in any of the four sectors of our life: our body, our mind, our emotions, and our behaviors. Everybody has a self-healing response. In spite of what they may go through, we as human beings do things to try to help ourselves survive. And trauma survivors engage in altruism, helping other people, work if they have it in terms of employment or doing something for other people for a fee or something, and spirituality, feeling that their life is connected to God or to some ultimate purpose. Whenever someone has experienced violence, they want acknowledgement about that. They want an apology if they can get it. They want compensation for what's happened. They want the perpetrator to be punished, and the victim struggles with offering forgiveness. And one of the most significant things associated with being trauma is stigma. And so people who feel stigmatized by their violent experience may shun getting help, and because they don't want to be stigmatized. So the shame that some people feel as a result of having been traumatized prevents them from seeking help. And religious helpers, those who are religious, can play a vital role in reducing this shame by reminding those suffering from trauma that there is no shame in getting help, that in fact doing so is a sign of their strengths. When a person has been traumatized, it can create a real spiritual problem for those who are religious. A traumatic experience for religious people can cause them to question their understanding and practice of religion, their beliefs about God, and their traumatic experience can throw them into a whirlwind of religious doubt and confusion and existential angst and anger. Last but not least, on the other hand, religious beliefs and spiritual orientation of some people who have experienced a traumatic event can be for them a source of strength and guidance through their midnight of their trauma. So in this sense, people who are religious can use their faith practices as skills for living and not just a matter of beliefs. And so as we think about our brothers and sisters, particularly the overwhelming number of sisters and women who are victims of violence, we have to keep in mind not all of them would be traumatized, but for those who are, they need to have that side of their struggle attended to. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Brother Streets. So, Mr. Bentley, what is domestic violence?
Hello, Kevin. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the men of Omega Sci-Fi Fraternity Incorporated for this opportunity to participate in the Uplift series. I say hello to my colleagues and panelists, and I want to thank the people who are tuning in this evening to participate in this conversation about domestic violence. Domestic violence, as it is typically defined pretty much in every state around the country, it's when a person is forced or coerced to do something against their will by another person. The behavior can include physical behaviors, verbal assaults, emotional assaults, financial or sexually, someone being taken advantage of, or a combination of just one or any of those behaviors can interact together. Domestic violence is seen across many age groups, from teenagers, where we see something that typically is called dating violence. That's in the literature. It's what it typically looks like. It can occur with adults of opposite sex relationships. It can also occur with adults with same-sex relationships. When we look at it from my intervention work, we also understand that it can occur between family members. So anyone living in a domicile where there's some sort of violence that has been perpetrated against one another, that typically meets the criteria for domestic violence or family violence or intimate partner violence. The statistics really are just humbling, where domestic violence and interpersonal physical violence can occur in a wide range of homes, where social and economic status does not exclude you at all from domestic violence. So we see it in some of the more affluent homes, and we see it in the less affluent homes. So there really is no group that is outside the range where domestic violence can occur. The CDC tells us, and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, statistics tell us that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their lifetime. The research in the last 10 years or so tells us that 1 in 10 men will experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their lifetime. When we begin to talk about teenagers, the numbers start to really give a very stark awakening to what many teenagers may experience. And 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have reported rape, physical violence, stalking by an intimate partner, or a firsthand experience with violence in a relationship between the ages of 11 and 17 years of age. What we know with COVID, all across the globe, not just New Haven, not the United States, but all across the globe, we have an increase in domestic violence of about 30%. Like for everyone to keep in mind that domestic violence oftentimes is underreported. So that number could be as high as 40%. It could be even higher. But again, the statistics that we do have worldwide tell us that it's about a 30% increase in domestic violence due to COVID. As an interventionist, we oftentimes tell people to look for warning signs in relationships. So some of the warning signs include when a partner is extremely jealous, when there is a partner who is very possessive of another person. Also, we ask people to look for unpredictability in a relationship. And what we mean by that is it's very difficult to find any evenness with a relationship. So it's up sometimes, it's down sometimes, it's happy sometimes, other times it's contentious. And the unpredictability is definitely a high warning sign of an insecure relationship. When people present with uneven tempers or intense tempers, and typically these persons, small things can set them off very, very, very quickly. And the intensity of the relationship is what can be very frightening to anybody in the home. We look out for people who have a history of verbal abusiveness. We sometimes see people who have rigid beliefs of roles in a relationship. So this partner is supposed to do this. This partner is supposed to do that. No, I can't do that. That's your role. And the inflexibility in how relationship roles operate are very sensitive areas in many relationships. We also look for people who blame other people for anything bad that happens in the relationship. So no matter what, somebody is always being accused of the person that caused the poor circumstance to occur. We sometimes, as Dr. Streets talked about, people engage in embarrassing people or humiliating people in front of others. And that really is a red flag, where maybe you're out for dinner, maybe you're out visiting friends, and somewhere in that moment, a person takes it upon themselves to humiliate another person. We also see that people that perpetrate violence seem to hold grudges for extended periods of time. They also, in conflict, they must have the last word, and their last word is it. That's the law of the land. And anybody that should challenge that, it tends to cause the relationship moment to become very, very, very contentious. Something that people don't think about, but relationships are based upon not only the physical love and the feelings that you have with one another, but also with communication skills. So we find that people who engage in intimate partner violence, family violence, domestic violence, some of them have very poor communication skills. So they only have one way to say something. And when that one way doesn't work, then they fall back on using violence or force to, if you will, control another person. With COVID, we see high reports of people stating that family stress has increased, and that's causing strains with relationships. The economic stress that COVID is putting many homes in jeopardy of not knowing if you're going to work. Where's the money going to come from? Where's the food going to come from? Dr. Streets talked about, having safety, having the house, roof over your head, being able to engage in close relationships with folks, and uncertainty of resources. The reports have also been people who have been locked in are feeling a great deal of stress to not being able to get out and see other people, not be able to get engage in activities or fun activities, with the children home for school all the time. Now I'm being asked to be a teacher, and that's not my role. So there's a lot of stress that seems to be boiling over with COVID in these last 6-7 months. Also, when people have less supportive families, or they have few friends that they can access, and as the stress goes up, many people have utilized the system of family or friends in order to help them work through difficult situations or circumstances. Access to church, not being able to access church. So we see that as people's support systems have decreased, that also has put an increased stress on people, where we recognize that some of that is leading to an increase in domestic violence incidences in families and homes. So I'd like to just end there and just use this as putting out that information for people to think about as we have the discussion this evening with my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. So, Detective Carr, what is the role of the Family Services Unit?
Okay, so family services, we deal with a few different, first of all, let me say thank you for having me, because I'm going to get right into it. Sorry about that. Thank you for having me. And the role is we do several different things. We deal with different incidents such as sexual abuse, risk of injury to children, which is abuse specifically to children, babies, and sudden deaths, like if a baby may not wake up, they could possibly have been hurt, or they could have possibly just died of natural causes. We deal with domestic violence as well. That unit just deals with anything that the families may need, as well as juveniles, people under the age of 18 as well. So it's a whole form of things that we do, and we see a lot of different calls. As far as domestic violence is concerned, we have saw that there are more calls coming in. Since COVID has happened, as the two previous speakers just said, people are under a tremendous amount of stress, and they're taking it out on their partners. All partners are not female. I have dealt with men that have been victims of domestic violence as well. And sometimes people, when we talk about domestic violence, we don't even think of men. We don't think that they can be victims of this, but they can. And it's extremely underreported. It's underreported for females because sometimes they are financially dependent on their abusers, but it's also underreported for men because they feel like they can't be a victim. There's a stigma attached, as the previous speaker said, to it, and they feel like it's an attack on their ego. So they don't look for people to help them because they don't even want to classify themselves as a victim. But we see everything. We see children, we see teenagers, we see men, we see women. No, domestic violence is not biased. Anyone can be a victim. And it's important during COVID that we do look out for the signs, as the previous speaker said, because people are in positions that, because they're stuck in the house, they are not able to talk to anybody about this right now. They're stuck in their house with the abuser, whether it be a female or it be a male, and they're financially and solely dependent on that person right now. They don't have the opportunity to get out there and call, or if they're just going to school, have that break from the abuser, or if they're just going to work, to have that break from the abuser. So it's important that the people that's around them look for the signs, look for a person just not being available at all, because that may be a sign that they do need help. I also want to put out there for any victims, anybody that may be experiencing domestic violence right now, if you're not able to call, you can also text the police department at 911. If you are not able to talk on the phone and you need help, immediately, make sure you take advantage of that as well.
Great, thank you. And I had a couple of follow-up questions, but I know Paula has been very patient with us. So, Paula, could you just tell us what it is that happens at the Hope Family Justice Center?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today. I'm definitely honored to be part of this panelist and to speak with people about domestic violence and just abuse that people are suffering. Here at the Hope Family Justice Center, it is truly a movement around the world. There are family justice centers in Paris, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and all across the United States. We were definitely privileged to be able to open one up here in New Haven, and we serve from Madison all the way to the Valley area. And we also serve anybody that calls us. So we get calls from Willimantic, from Hartford, and really anybody that calls is going to get served at the Hope Family Justice Center. It is how we respond to victims and having systems learn what traumatized victims of abuse deal with. And what we do is we actually work with systems and collaborators and partners to be able to change how we respond to domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and any type of other abuse. And trauma is not just on physical abuse and emotional abuse. Trauma also consists of poverty, homelessness, and racial disparity, which we also deal with. It is a one-stop shop of free wraparound services of over 52 partners within our community to provide free and confidential services and care that is trauma responsive. So I want to just talk about that. A lot of people talk about being trauma informed, and that's wonderful as we get expertise and understand what trauma looks like and what are the signs. But trauma responsive is what our language is to people, how we respond to people, the environment that we set up for people. So here at the Hope Family Justice Center, it's a very peaceful, welcoming, non-clinical environment so that you can feel cozy and cared for. We have victims that come in after shootings in the morning. They fall asleep in our family lounge. We provide them ways to be able to connect with partners, especially after COVID. We've set up areas here so that we can actually do webcams so that victims that come in will be able to access the services immediately and directly without a gap in that service. We are also client-centered, strength-based, and hope-driven. A lot of people that come here have already been disenfranchised through many different multi-layered trauma and polyvictimization within their community and their culture. And so we're here to wrap them around and nurture them in whatever that they need. We have partners that are from domestic violence advocates, sexual assault counselors. We have shelters, law enforcement, detective coroner partner very much with a lot of cases, medical, mental health providers, legal representatives, healthcare folks at Yale that will actually come to the center when somebody's over-triggered. We have court support services, educational institutes, faith-based organizations, all providing these services. We also have a wellness center, so I really want to focus on that too. It's about the wellness of the person. We look at them as a holistic way instead of just as an abused person. Their identification of who they are is usually a victim. So we really work on having that person go from victim to survivor to thriver. And that's really the developmental healing of trauma that we do here today. Also, you know, when somebody goes through a trauma, what we found is that when people respond and how they respond to people that are suffered abuse shows whether they're able to heal from the trauma. We have found, so I'm going to just give you a brief example. So I love car accidents, right? Car accidents, somebody gets into a car accident, people come running, right? People come running from other cars, the police come, if there needs to be a lawyer involved, they show up. And then after the car accident, their boss is calling them. You need to take time off. If you need some care, don't worry about it. It's okay. We're just checking in to see if you're okay. Your family members are calling going, oh my God, I was so afraid that you were going to get hurt and that I'm so happy that you're okay. When somebody goes through domestic violence or sexual assault, the response is usually silent. People are uncomfortable in how that they respond to people, and usually the folks feel isolated from their natural supports and also their community. And that is why we bring all of these partners together so that we can actually have a community response of non-judgment and love, but also services that they need that they do not have to pay for. We also, I just wanted to say, the first family justice center that was opened up in San Diego, within the first 3 years that they were open, they reduced domestic violence homicides by 95%. And so working with law enforcement, knowing that domestic calls are one of the most dangerous calls because they do not know what to expect when they get onto the call, and also for the victim as well. So the community is also affected by this. Most serial killers and most mass murderers have had domestic violence or sexual assault trauma in their past, in their childhood. So we also have to think about that even though we're talking about victims, survivors, and thrivers of abuse, we also have to remember that those that do abuse have also had trauma themselves. And when we think about prevention, it's really working with small children, with families. How do they communicate together? Is there a language of love and hope that they have? And can they nurture each other through the good times and the bad? Since COVID-19, we have had an increase of violent crimes, shootings, stalkings, strangulations, increase of severities, and hospitalizations. We get calls from victims in bathrooms with showers on in basements, when they run out of the house to be able to grab something to eat, and they're able to call us. This is how intense for them it is while they're being isolated and confined with their abusers and also with their children. So I just want to say we are here to help. Since July of 2019, we've had over 2,000 visits at the center, and we've just open. And I just want people to know, if there's anybody out there right now that's listening that has suffered abuse, whether it's now or 20 years ago, and you need a place to go, please call us at the Hope Family Justice Center, and we will do our best to help you and start helping you heal.
Great, thank you. And this is all wonderful information, so thank you all for sharing. And I imagine we will, some of the stuff will be repeated several times because we feel that it's important for people to hear. But we will give you I have a question from the audience, from Anthony Charles. And I think this question is probably going to Mr. Bentley. Are the signs the same for youth that are experiencing domestic violence as that of an adult, or are they completely different?
I would say that we see some differences based upon the developmental age of the person. As I mentioned earlier, we see the challenges with people as young as 11 and 12 and 13. So what you may see from them is you may see some acting out. You may see them with withdrawing from things that they typically enjoy. They no longer enjoy. They may become very irritable because they don't have the words to say what's going on. They just, everything irritates them. So I would say that we oftentimes see in teens and young adults a different presentation than we do with adults who have greater language skills, who have greater life experiences, and also the experience of being able to talk to someone. Oftentimes, teenagers at that very difficult time in their lives, they can talk to other teenagers, but they have significant difficulty expressing themselves to adults because they feel that adults just won't get it. So I think that we see developmentally how the teens may act out is their cry for help, where for adults, oftentimes they're able to at least come up with some courage to approach someone to say, hey, this is happening to me. So I do feel that there's a difference between the way teens present these ways to express themselves and adults. And I think that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Detective Carr, so you said that you work amongst other things with sexual abuse, risk of injury to children, domestic violence. So a two-part question for you. So how much would you say of your work is around domestic violence? And the second part of that is, what's the level of involvement with teenagers around abuse and domestic violence?
Okay, so majority, in 2016, I came into the Family Services Unit, and prior to COVID, we didn't have a specialized unit for domestic violence. The specialized unit for domestic violence has just recently been, I wouldn't say more of a focus, especially since the Family Justice Center. I'm the person that goes over to the Family Justice Center and works closely with Paula and other individuals that are there and other partnerships. So the majority of my work is with domestic violence. But what you have to know is that domestic violence is coupled with so many other things. Like, if someone's being sexually abused, they could be with the intimate partner. If someone's being human trafficked, they can be with the intimate partner and with other people. So domestic violence is kind of like an umbrella over other things. If someone is a victim of domestic violence, it's more likely that the child in that relationship is also being abused. So it's kind of like a slippery slope. They're all mixed up together, but domestic violence is in tune with so many other things. So I would say the majority is domestic violence, but once you get into it and you start to peel back the layers, you see that either the victims or the victim children are suffering from other things as well. So I don't really say it's a separation. And the second question I think you asked about how do I see teens? There's a lot of teens that I see that are suffering from domestic violence. It's starting at a very early age, not only domestic violence, but that are also being sold and pimped out and things like that. So it's not biased at all. It's not biased. I've seen young as 8 years old being involved in an intimate domestic violence situation.
Okay, wow. Thank you for sharing that. So Reverend Streets, in your role and in your various roles, I imagine you have opportunity to come across people involved in these sorts of relationships. And what is it that you're hearing in terms of how COVID has been impacting these relationships?
It's the feeling of isolation and alienation, being cut off, as my three other panelists have said in different ways, being cut off from a larger social network of relationships, be it through work or church or through a social organization in the community. So it's the isolation and alienation that makes people feel like they're just kind of being held captive in the family and in that abusive relationship. And we all know that spiritually and psychologically, one of the most burdensome things a person can really feel and think is that they have no options. That's when you really think you don't have an option. And I'm glad that my colleagues have all talked about the resources that people can reach out to, because once you know that there's some possibility that can crack open that context in which you feel so alienated and isolated and locked into.
Thank you. And on that point about isolation, we have a comment, and I would direct this to Paula, but it's a pretty long one. So I just want you to respond to the comment. It's not necessarily a question. And L. Charles said, isolation is also a sign of DMV, like all of you had said. And even during non-COVID times, the abuser will create discord between victim and friends and families, so the victim has less support, and it's easier to violate the victim. The victim has less places to go, less people to turn to, and this creates a perfect abusive relationship when a victim is by him or herself. So you'd like to respond to that, Paula?
Well, I think that they're absolutely right, that gentleman is on target. That's the whole thing of abuse, right? It's about power and control. It's about keeping somebody under your control and having power over them. And a lot of times what ends up happening with isolation is that is how they're able to take control of their whole life. They discourage them from going to further education. They discourage them from employment. Their relationships with their family members are now being destroyed and being disconnected. They start taking away their ability to be in control of their own life, with their own finances, with their own people in the community. Being able to go to a place where they can find hope and faith, just like church, just like going to work, just to have that respite. And so in some way, due to COVID, they've had more power and more control over this type of isolation that they created before COVID happened. And so stalking has been because of that. And that is why there's a higher serious injury, because people can't get out like they used to be able to get out. Go to mom's house, go to your brother's house, be able to connect to somebody in the community. So isolation is one of the biggest signs when a child, when a teenager starts talking about My boyfriend doesn't want me to wear this or that, or I can't talk to my friends anymore, or I can't go to my soccer practice or basketball practice. Right there is a clear sign that somebody's trying to take power and control over their life. And that's what creates isolation.
And so how do we often hear people say, oh, I wish I known, I would have offered to help. How do we do that? How do we intervene? So as a basketball coach, I noticed that one of my players is just, you know what, he's not coming to practice, and I'm hearing stuff in the community that his girlfriend does this and that. How would I intervene in that? Or how do we intervene in that type of situation?
Well, this is the community's response, sir, right? And this is when people within the community that are seeing the signs don't also become paralyzed from the shame and embarrassment of trauma. A lot of times it's really hard, even at doctors' offices, to do screenings for trauma, to do screenings for abuse. And so one of the first things that you can do, and it really sits in the body, that type of suffering and pain. And so when you're talking about teenagers, you will see it through their body more than their words. So that man, that coach, that woman, whoever it is that's connecting with that child, sit them down, sit quietly for a moment, be connected in a spiritual and energy space to allow that person to talk about what's going on. But we as a community have to do much better in being able to explain what resources are out there. If you're going to open up Pandora's box on somebody that's dealing with that type of trauma and suffering, you should know where to send them to. And so it's finding places that you're already connected with. If there's somebody from the church that does mentoring, an elderly person that's maybe gone through trauma themselves or abuse themselves, bring them into the conversation. They might be knowledgeable about other resources. Call places like the helpline, the police department, and they could let you know. Call the Hope Family Justice Center, whatever service that you need. If we don't have it on site, we will find it for you. And I think we just need to do a better job marketing and really disseminating the information out to providers and people that are with these children, with these teenagers, with these people that are suffering abuse, so that we can connect them not just to any service, but to the right people that are going to care.
So the community has some responsibility in that role. Right, gotcha.
Yes,
and I
we
totally
do.
agree. So I want to really quickly. So I've been informed to share with the panel that L. Charles, who has been very active on our chat, is a woman. So, so I have. I'll go to you, Mr. Bentley. And Reverend Streets, the same question will hold true for you, but I'll go Mr. Bentley first. How can we, this is from Galaxy S8. I'm not sure, I don't think that's this person's real name, but we'll go with Galaxy X8. How can we raise our girls and boys in ways that change this narrative? How can we socialize boys and girls differently and change these patterns? And I imagine talking about the patterns of abuse, whether it's victim or perpetrator. And I'm adding on. So,
Brother Kevin, to start off with, I think is family members. One of the things that we can introduce young people to is literature that has some empathetic lessons to teach them. And there's a couple books. One is by A.J. Franklin and his wife, and it's called Raising African American Boys. And that's a book that's very helpful, where it allows parents to learn what to say to their children, how to model for their children. There's some other books out there. Kevin Powell has some books. Amos Wilson has some books. We have to sometimes, it's difficult to have conversations with children. So what we do is we open up the literature, we open up books, and we use that as a way to start conversations. And oftentimes when you read something to a young person, they'll respond to that, and that will stimulate some conversation. So I think there's quite a number of books that begins to talk about raising the type of children that you want. And as adults, we've got to go seek out those resources. We got to seek out those books that really helps us have the conversation with our children. And sometimes the conversation is greater than we are. So we reach out and we get some help. And having some literature to work with, or finding movies that you want to show to express an idea and then have a conversation. I think that's how you begin to socialize our children to maybe be the types of persons that we hope that they will, and reduce violence in their lives and help them make conscientious choices to understand that they do have choices. They don't have to follow what everybody else is doing. Help them develop their strength, help them develop their character, help them develop their hope. But more than anything, empathy for others. Because once children can feel empathy for others, then their behavior changes and they become better citizens. If they have an attitude like, I don't care, you ask them like, I don't care, that child would do anything to anybody because they're telling you they don't care. So you have to get to that teenager. You have to say, well, check this situation out. Read this, like I saw this, let's watch this movie. And afterwards, we have to be audacious enough to have hard conversations with our children and not be reactive. Let them tell us what's on their mind and then begin to help them process it. So that's a way that I would say that is a pretty easy way to do things. But as adults, we've got to find the literature that matches the lessons that we want to teach and then engage that. And I think Reverend Streets will talk about also getting our children involved in organizations that teach character. And as you do as a basketball coach, Kevin, you bring them and you create this community within the community where you can teach some valuable life lessons. And I think that's what sports does. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I totally agree. I would just add, if it's not really, it's a variation. You think about what is basic to nurturing a child's self-esteem, the sense of self-worth from birth on. I mean, it's actually before birth, because the way a mother takes care of her body and her child being born is a reflection of self-esteem. So doing those things, the idea that of storytelling that was just mentioned is just fantastic, because that's how particularly children up to even high school age, particularly that age range, are really into stories and metaphors and good guys, bad guys, good women, bad women, that kind of thing. So you can teach a lot about character and values, and explore with the child how they feel about the characters that you're reading to them about, or the stories that they're reading, or the movies that they're seeing, or the stuff they might see on social media, and to further foster that sense of empathy. How do you feel about what so-and-so did or what so-and-so said? So storytelling with the central feature being self-esteem of the child. It means that the parenting person, whether they're the biological parent or not, will have to be very mindful to kind of guide their response to a child by asking themselves the question, in my response, am I damaging or am I nurturing this child's sense of self-worth?
Great, thank you for that. Very profound. And if I may, so one of the things was Lester talked about me as a coach, and one of the things that I noticed was the language that our boys were using on the court. And so what we make it as a rule and almost a law is that one of the things that boys say in basketball, they say they want someone to take them to the basket, they'll say, oh, lay her, or they say, oh, you throw like a girl. And we curb that behavior and have that conversation as, why are you referring to them as the lesser, as it's being derogatory. And we also don't allow our young men to refer to women as bitches, or any other, or ugly, or any negative words. And we have that conversation, and it's really around equity, but it's also around respect and things of that nature. So I agree that it's very important. I will say, I got another, Detective Carr, Ruel Dixon wants to know, at what age should one start educating their child or children about abusive relationships?
Well, first of all, I think it starts as soon as the child is born, because if they see their mother or father being abused or being the abuser, they will most likely become that. So I would say as soon as they're born, like, you have to model the type of behavior that you will want them to be, or you just like anything else. If you want your child to have manners, you start teaching your child as soon as they come out the womb, right? As soon as the way to talk, the way to respond to something, the way to be respectful. I think it starts very early on, and I say don't wait too late. Don't wait until you see signs of someone being disrespected or letting someone disrespect them. I think it starts from the beginning.
Great, thank you. And Paula, Odoms wants to know, as a person who was on the outside that identifies the behavior of a victimizer, how can you reach someone, a potential victim, who doesn't believe what is happening to them?
You know, and it was something that I wanted to echo Lester and Detective Carr on, is we all have a fantasy of what we would think our perfect relationship is. And within that fantasy, there is a person that has empathy, non-judgment, care, love for them. Once you start talking to somebody that's being victimized and doesn't want to see that piece, talking about what does that fantasy of that love would look like for them? What does a healthy relationship look like to them? What would that world look like? What would be their vision of that love life that they want to have? And it could be with their intimate partner, it could be with their parent, it could be with anybody that they're feeling victimized. Oftentimes, you know, even though they come here at the center and we work with law enforcement and all these other providers, a lot of times they're not ready for that. DCF will drop people off and say, you need to provide wraparound services, and, you know, she's been victimized. And by the time they get here, they have not been heard. They have not told their story in their own narrative, in their own words. And one thing that I think sometimes providers and us in the community, coaches and doctors and such, we put words in their mouth to identify what they're feeling. They are calling it domestic violence. They are calling it feeling unsafe, feeling hurt, feeling pain, wishing that that person would be the person that they knew before when they were in the moonlight stage of their love and their relationship. And so when we're thinking about having this discussion with somebody that is maybe in denial or maybe does realize it, but because there's other barriers like finances, like their children, like homelessness, like poverty, like isolation, when you start layering that, their priority of need on getting services for abuse come down here. Right? It's the hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's law. And so sometimes what we do is we build a relationship with them. We put pennies in the bank with them. We build trust with them. We say, okay, you need housing, let's start there. Let's get some higher education so you can have a career job, so you can be self-sufficient and self-sustained, and empower that person. And once you start empowering that person, their story comes out. Then they really start saying, yes, I was abused. Yes, I've gone through this. Because now It's a relationship between two human beings. And so when we really think about what happens to somebody, a victim of any type of abuse and any type of disparity, you have to start where they're at. And oftentimes we want to start up here, but they're just right here at the deepest, darkest pain that they've ever felt in their life. Because you know what? People still love those people. They're still in love with them. And we will never, ever, ever be able to take away that emotional feeling. And so where we have to reach them is where is that fantasy of love? And how can we make that reality? And is this person filling that? And let me tell you, after a while of being able to encompass this person with this holistic view of who they are, they will then start telling their true story.
I have found, I agree. I've also found that sometimes when someone appears to be denying, and or if they really are denying or avoiding, that what's really one of the things that's really behind that behavior is a deep fear. And so I try to get them to talk about what are they afraid of. If X were to happen, if this was to change, if they were to do something different in what they're doing. And I think part of the comments that Paula just made helps to echo that once they trust you with their story, you find out what the fear is, which is often more gripping than what we think is denial or avoidance.
For non-compliance.
Yes.
How many times people say, oh, she's being, or he's being non-compliant, but it's not that. It's because they're emotionally dysregulated.
Right.
And somebody else has told their story for them instead of them telling their own.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I'm sorry.
If I could just add a point, because what they're touching on is some people don't even realize just yet that they are victims. And you'll see sometimes that you go, just as a police officer responding, you go to a call over and over and over again, or even if that person is your family member and you know that they may split or take the person back, split and take the person back. I think it's important that they still have that support, that you still be supportive, because it's going to take time for a person to be like, I'm done with this and I'm leaving. It's going to take time for them to realize the trauma and get ready to deal with it. So I think it's important for the community, family members, even police officers, anyone that deals with this victim, to understand that it takes time, and it may take several times. So you have to have patience with that victim.
And you cannot blame the victim. And a lot of times what we often do, if I can just follow up with what Detective Carr, I think she's really hitting it on the nose, is that what we often do is we get tired. The family members get tired. The providers get tired. Oh, she's back again. Oh, she's going back to him again. And so when we talk about non-judgment, I'm not saying that as a semantic word. I mean it. We really need to be non-judgmental. We need to keep going back, like Detective Carr is saying, without judgment, saying, I'm here for you today. What can we do today? Where are you today? Let's reach you today where you're at. And then you keep working with them. But it's oftentimes what ends up happening, and why people stop reporting, is that they feel like they're a burden to people, that they've done this so many times. Their parents are saying, are giving up on them. Providers are exhausted by saying the same thing over and over again. But it's almost like children sometimes. We have to repeat ourselves because they will believe what the abuser has said to them. They are not worthy. They're not worthy of love. They're not worthy of having a job. They're not worthy of being a whole person. And so when somebody is being told that over and over and over again, you coming 7, 8 times to the house, Detective Carr, it'll be number 12 that maybe they'll say, okay, take me to where you need to take me. And so we cannot get tired and we cannot get exhausted And we cannot be angry inside with that victim. We have to come with them through love and patience, what is really what we need.
Well, I think that is probably, that was so profound, because I think, and I thank you all for centering that piece about us needing us supporters, right? For lack of a better word, being non-judgmental and being committed to being there every day, because you would think, and I'm pretty sure we've seen it, where we do get tired of, because it's easy for us to say, oh, well, they must like it because they keep going back, or this person is stupid and stuff. So I know for me personally, hearing some of those reasons why it's hard has opened my eyes up to that. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. So we have a question here, and I'll go to Lester, right? And speaking of that, and also courageous. So Rocky Rose is speaking from personal experience, and what I realized about my abuser, an ex of mine, is that he suffered from a great lack of self-esteem. And he found that beating on me made him feel more of a man. So is that your experience, Lester? Not as beating on someone, but as in your role as a professional?
I'm going to go back to something that Paula said, and that was a person's self-esteem oftentimes is tied up into what type of relationship and how they're going to manage their relationship with others. There has been some early research, particularly, and it's old research, but I think it's valid, in the 60s or 70s, where men who felt less powerful when they were out working in their social sphere, oftentimes would come home and take whatever powerless feelings they had earlier in the day, they could come home where they now feel powerful. And some of the research says that they would come home, and it's called displaced anger. So even though they were angry at another situation or circumstance, they would come home and focus that anger on who was available. And typically it was the children, it was the pets, and it was the partner. So self-esteem and this feeling of power and powerlessness, they are connected together and they hold on to each other. And for some people, it's a vicious circle that they are wrapped up into, where if they are humiliated sometimes during the day, they will come home and they will displace that anger and take that anger out on any and everybody who's close, because they can't do that outside of the home. So again, self-esteem has a lot to do with how people have relationships with other people. Reverend Street said, if you have self-esteem, positive self-esteem, you probably will want to treat people the way that you want to be treated. If you have low self-esteem, then you're probably going to demand from others what you don't, in fact, have yourself. So I do feel that self-esteem has a lot to do with how people lash out at other people, with the concept of called displaced anger, which oftentimes supports, or low self-esteem supports displaced anger between people.
Great, thank you. All right, so we'll move it on. We got about 20 minutes, and we want to make sure we wrap up, get to some more questions. But I just want to shift a little bit, and because we've been talking about this conversation with men and women, and it's had this heterosexual slant, although we have talked about it could be in all genders and gender on gender. So my question, and I'll start with you, Detective Carr, do members of the LGBTQ community experience domestic violence? They do, but what does it look like? And for our audience, what does it look like, and how is it the same, right? Because that's what we've been talking about. It doesn't matter your gender, sexual orientation.
Well, to be honest, I don't think there's a difference. I don't think it looks any different than any other heterosexual couple. I think people experience the same thing. As the panelist just said prior, people with low self-esteem act out the same way. So regardless of whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to try to talk to that person, degrade that person, displace anger. You're going to hit on that person because you feel powerful over them. Whether you're a woman and you have a power over a man, or a man over a woman, or a man over a man over a woman or a woman, it's all the same thing. It's not different because of your sexual preference. It's the same thing.
Right. Okay. Yep. Thank you. Paula, same question.
I apologize, I was muted. Again, this is a human condition, self-esteem, empathy, the psychology of somebody's brain and how they hold their trauma within their body. And so, you know, one thing though, I do have to say is, you know, when you're dealing with transgender folks, there is an added element of shame because they've transitioned and they have not been accepted by society sometimes. And so one of the issues that I have seen with some of the transgenders, they don't know whether they fit into a male abusive relationship or a woman's abusive relationship. And so again, the power and control will be the same whether you're female on female, men on men, or heterosexual. But when you add a layer of somebody is already dealing with their identity and having already an identity crisis, especially a teen, which we have had that have been transgender here, there's an added layer of shamefulness of who am I and where do I get help? And that's, I guess, the other piece of it is, where do they get help? Where is there somebody that can actually hear them as a person and not as their gender? Just like we wouldn't want somebody that looks at you by your color and how you're going to respond, but that you are a human being. And I think that we need to do better as a community. And I do go back to that as us not placing those societal constructs on people that are trying to get help. So again, I agree with Detective Carr and everybody else on the panel. Abuse is abuse, power and control doesn't see gender, but what it does see when somebody's having a gender sexual orientation crisis, especially in their developmental age group of it being a teenager, when you're trying to figure out who are you, okay, that it is harder to find resources for them. And so again, I go back to the community. What can we do better so that they know where to go?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I agree with what's been said. The social stigma can take on an even weightier dimension for members of the LGBTQ community if they are not clear about where, as Paula just said, where the resources are. So if you've got the stress and strain of the difficult relationship, and then on top of that, you're not sure how you're going to be received once you do reach out for help, or you don't know where to go for help. And if you do go for help, once you find some resources, you worry about how you're going to be accepted. So that's an additional stressor to say the least.
Great, thank you. So we have about 15 minutes and we have lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to deviate from my sheet, my questions here. And I have one for Mr. Bentley. What does domestic violence interventionist counseling consist of, and how successful is it for domestic violence perpetrators?
That's a really good question. So I'll start off with, there are voluntary programs where someone recognizes that, hey, I'm having some difficulty in my relationship, and they maybe will seek individual counseling, or sometimes families will go to marriage and family counseling to try to work out their challenges. When a person, or there's also anger management counseling also. oftentimes when the person finds and they identify that they have an issue and they seek help about it, they're really, really, really invested in making a change because that's something that they want to do. So I think the voluntary programs, individual counseling, group counseling are very effective. In the work that I've done, I've worked with alternative incarceration programs and with the Family Violence Education Program in New Haven, Connecticut. And we were fortunate. We had a really, really good cohort of facilitators. And chances are we're looking at persons who offended one time. And we would gauge this about a rearrest. They were successful in not being rearrested almost 75 to 80% of the time. So I think that program was really helpful. And the outcomes that we had seemed to indicate that the intervention was useful. And it really was an advantage to CSSD doing the work to think that if we can give people education, we can help strengthen families. Then the other thing, unfortunately, Kevin, is it also depends upon people's desire to change. And the people who are least able to or want to change, they tend to make the same mistakes over and over and over. And sometimes it takes something from counseling, something more than intervention. And unfortunately, that group actually moves over to the punishment phase, where they just really have a lack of ability to make a change. And they've had to face some other circumstances to help them change. So again, individual counseling, a person identifies, I want this, it probably is the most successful. And then court order intervention can be successful with the quality of the program and the quality of the facility. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. So, and I want to piggyback on something that you said, Detective Carr. So what are the consequences for a perpetrator of domestic violence?
Well, there's a few different laws and, violations such as assault or strangulation, or they can do anything to that person, just family violence will be attached to violation. So in the court system, they have like a separate docket that deals with just specifically domestic violence. That's how prevalent it is and how serious our courts take it. I want to shift a little because this kind of COVID has affected this because the courts have been shut down. So they do see domestic violence cases every day. They do. You get the next court date. Like, say if you're arrested for a domestic violence incident, let's just say assault, and there's family violence attached to it, you have to go to court the next day. You have to be seen by a judge so that a judge can order like a conditions of release, and you'll have the opportunity to get a restraining order and things like that. But any violation of Connecticut general statute, it can have family violence attached to it. So you can go outside and you can not physically hit me, but you could damage my property, but we have a relationship. It could be attached to it. You could physically hit me and family violence will be attached to it. You can threaten me and family violence will be attached to it. So there's just not like one specific or a few specific statutes that are for domestic violence or family violence, as they would categorize it.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask this question so anyone can jump in if you know the answer. Is Greg Vader Johnson, Big Greg wants to know, is there legislation in place for victims in Connecticut where they're protected from their abusers?
Go ahead, since I'm a policy nerd. And I do a lot of advocacy up in Hartford. So there is legislation. We passed 24/7 shelters. We passed ex parte orders where people have to relinquish their guns while they're getting a restraining order. So we do have legislation that we're still working on, and still being able to protect the victim. I do want to say with legislation, it should never stop. We have to go deeper in that legislation. So I want to go back to what Detective Carr was talking about with the court. You know, courts were closed for the majority of the pandemic. Even though people were being able to do things online, it was very difficult for victims to do restraining orders, zero custody, zero visitation, zero divorces, anything like that, that's family law, you were able to get through. And so what ended up happening is we had such a backlog in the court and the arraignments that I have court cases that are out in December that happened back in April. They're reducing, and so I'm going to talk about it because I want to be real. Okay, they're reducing some of the judgments. They're having people getting released. They're reducing the level of bonds. They do not want to have prisoners in the incarcerated while COVID, especially if they're people that are older or susceptible. But one of the trends that we definitely have seen is the reducing of even the charges, that you have felony charges that haven't been followed through. The police do a great job. They try to catch the guy. They're asking for warrants and things like that. But at the same time, it's so much easier to hide right now with COVID as well. So they're looking for people that are literally hiding and are able to hide during COVID. And so we really have had, so with legislation, that's something I would like to see change, that no matter what, like once you've been charged with something, you can't reduce the charges just because we have a pandemic, because that person is just as dangerous today, if not more, because we do not have the safety nets that we did when we didn't have COVID. So I just wanted to throw that piece out. But with legislation and policy, you're always thinking about preventive measures, and preventive measures in legislation are a lot harder to pass because you can't say because of this, then this will happen. So I often talk about it as the battered women syndrome. It's an old 80s term that the person has to be battered and almost dead before they get services. Thank God today that's not where we're at. But I do think with the pandemic, what's happened is we have reverted back more where it will only be the most serious situations that people are able to go out for and that they're able to access services. And that's why we are so lucky in New Haven. We are so resource rich, and we really have a deep community of relationships with all of our providers here, all of us. And just sitting here today, we built new relationships that I'm hoping that we can utilize each other as we move forward even today. So any opportunity that we have like today, like this moment in time where we have people that are listening to us and telling them, please reach out for help. We now have created new relationships so that then we can reach out to each other.
And if I could add one point, if I could add one point about legislation, because it's important to know that if you want things to happen, you have to advocate. There's no problem with you calling the court and saying, well, what's going on with this case? What happened to this sentence? What are we doing with this? You have to be an advocate, not only for the victim, but other victims to come. So if you feel like something is not going right in court or it's just being pushed to the side, you call, or you call the police department if you have a question about your case. You have to continuously advocate for change to happen, because just because it's written down on a piece of paper does not necessarily mean it's being enforced.
And we take it one step further, that you need to contact your legislator. You need to contact your district legislator, whether it's Tony Walker, whether it's Pat Dillon, whether it's Senator Gary Winfield. They're there to listen to you. You have to be respectfully persistent when you're doing advocacy, and you have to go all the way up to the top sometimes to be heard. When Senator Winfield told me something once, and he said to me, he said, I only hear people that call me. I only know what's going on unless they call me. And so that is what we need to do. Call your legislators, find out who your representatives in your district, and reach out to them and tell them what you want to see change. Sorry.
Excuse me. I see we have 3 minutes, right? We have to begin to wrap up. So I want you all to finish with your last point around so with an uptick in COVID cases, we're facing another lockdown. What should we be prepared for in terms of domestic violence? And you all can have your last points, but centered around that question, and we can go ahead with you, Reverend Street.
A potential even more invisible sector of victims are elders, people with disabilities, and people with emotional and mental health issues who often are not able to indicate that they need help. So that's just another component of the domestic violent relationships that exist out there. My bottom line, I think, is what we've all been trying to say. If you feel that you're in an abusive situation, you don't have to feel that to be alone. Reach out. There's help available.
Thank you. Mr. Bentley.
I'll keep it short and sweet because of the interest of time. I'm just going to echo what Dr. Street said, and just understand that hopelessness will cause people to be inactive. So maintain some hope, maintain some faith, reach out to people if you need help, because there's help out there for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula.
Call the Family Justice Center, 203-800-7204, and we will connect you with the services that you need. During the pandemic, we have turned our walk-in center into a call-in center. So please call.
Thank you. And Detective Carr.
I would just say that understand that the police department is here to work for you, regardless of the feelings surrounding police right now. Understand that if you call, someone needs to help you. Okay, so if something happens to you, you call that non-emergency number 203-946-6316. If it is an emergency, you call 911. And for family that's out there, if you have any worries about somebody, be more vigilant, because the holidays are coming up, which is also an added stressor. So just be more vigilant and be supportive. And you can even call for a welfare check on a family member. It doesn't necessarily have to be the victim. So if you are that concerned, you can also make a call for someone as well.
Well, I want to thank you all. Before I turn it over to Brother Jones to close us out, I just want to thank you all from the likes of between your expertise and the comments and the questions. We probably could have did this all night, but in the interest of time, we're going to wrap up. So on behalf of the Social Action Committee, I just want to thank you all for sharing your time with us. This sounds like we're going to have a part 2, perhaps a part 3. And although October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we know that domestic violence and abuse does not take any time off. So any time would be an appropriate time. And I hope you all will be willing to come back with us. I will take a point of privilege, because I want to share this, especially when someone is being courageous and sharing their story. And I want to direct this to Detective Carr, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brother Jones. So Rocky Rose said she never understood the laws in Connecticut dealing with DV, domestic violence, because the judge was definitely trying to put my ex and I in jail when he was the one who dragged me down the street with his car. Please help people understand what happens when that call comes in.
Well, it all depends on the information that is given. And to be completely honest, it depends on who responds and how they understand the information, how you communicate the information. Sometimes when a victim, even though a victim calls, they don't necessarily want to tell their side of the story. Sometimes we don't ever get that side. So I think it's important to not lose what happens in communication, because to me, I can't even judge what happened in that situation because I feel like I'm missing some information. If you are the victim that's dragged by a vehicle, you should never be put in jail. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I would have to see the report and see what was reported, what did the person say. I think it's saying it was a third party who called the cops. Okay, so that's a little bit more information as far as if I'm having an argument with someone and I'm not the caller, but someone else is called, now they're narrating the story. They're telling what happened and they're not even a part of the story. So I think the way a situation is communicated and how the victim tells this story, sometimes a victim is not even ready to talk. Sometimes a cop misinterprets a victim not talking as a liar or as a person that did something and just don't want to tell what they did either. So I think it's going to take the community, that third party caller. I think it's going to take the victim. I think it's also really going to take the cop to see those signs and not be so quick to judge what happened without getting that information.
Great, thank you. And again, I have so many other questions, but we're going to do a stop right now. So again, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to our boss list, Alexander Jones, to close us out for the evening.
Thank you, Brother Walton. To our panelists, I just want to thank you for your expertise, but most importantly, I want to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank our guests, people that joined us tonight. Thank you for your support. And before I close out, I just want to say, next Tuesday is right around the corner. So if you haven't registered to vote or voted, let's make sure we do so. Thank you all. Be safe. Good night. And God bless.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you. Rocky Rose, check your message if you're still on.